Well, thank you very much, everyone, for coming. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Social justice is deciding and acting for the common good of everyone in society. It aims for everyone to share in society's resources, that's the economic, political, health, education, etc., so that no person or group or culture or religion or class is deprived. It comes from our belief in human dignity and that we are all participating in God's kingdom. So for the next little while, I'm going to share how over time the popes have given us particular teachings to the church and the world about principles to rebalance the common good when injustices arrive in society. Now we know from Matthew's Gospel when Jesus tells the story of the last judgment of the nations, that those who passed the judgment to enter paradise were those who had completed just a simple criteria. They had fed the hungry, given drink to the thirsty, clothed the naked, sheltered the homeless, visited the sick and the imprisoned, and buried the dead throughout their lives. They had acted for the common good. Now the church calls these the works. They ensure that everyone has what they need to survive, thrive, and live in hope. And it's our responsibility to see to it. And Jesus also told the parable of the Good Samaritan, challenging us to share and care for those beyond our familial circles. Now, up until about 200 years ago, that was the societal pattern across Christian Europe. People lived close to the land and produced what they needed to live, and they worked at trades from near their homes. But a large-scale societal revolution came about in the 19th century with the invention of engines and factories, the Industrial Revolution. Great. It's easy to celebrate this invention with its capacity for mass production and transport, and to miss the social upheaval it caused. People were cleared off the land. Were cleared off their small holdings by private landowners to make way for large fields for sheep to produce wool, and in hot countries to grow cotton for the factories. Now those displaced had to immigrate overseas or migrate to work in the factories and the mines. Society changed radically. It led to an obsession with profit-making by a few at the expense of the majority. A whole new class of poor developed. Pope, I'm sorry, this is a bit slow on it. Okay. Pope Leo XIII saw that merchants and industrialists were getting wealthy by oppressing the workers almost to slavery. In 1891, Leo addressed this unchristian development in society in his encyclical Rerum Novarum. This was the very first of a series of social encyclicals setting out the goal of a just society, that it is to achieve the common good. From Leo XIII's time to our time, each new social encyclical has pinpointed an issue or gap of justice in society of the particular time and set out the principles of justice for rebalancing the common good. In 1891, Leo XIII said, "In a just society, the economy must serve the people, not the other way around. To achieve the common good, employers must respect the dignity of workers. They must pay them," now this is not optional, "they must pay them just wages because workers should share in the profits that their work produces. They must give them safe and healthy conditions for work. They must give them time off so that they can fulfil their duties and their religious duties. And they must treat them justly in hiring and firing. And they must be allowed to have unions to advocate for just conditions. They must be allowed to strike if they were being treated unjustly." Now we can see that the Pope is not addressing personal devotion or charity. He's challenging the way Christians set up society. Challenging the way that Christians set up society so that some benefited and most missed out, and saying that for gospel justice, every person must be respected and people must gather in solidarity with those who are treated unjustly so that they can bring about change for the common good. Now, it wasn't until 40 years later that a new social encyclical appeared, and this was with Pius XI. He could see that after the First World War, there was a rise of dictators in Europe. And you'll remember, Mussolini in Italy and Hitler in Germany. He said that in society, totalitarian authority stripped people of their right to make decisions for themselves in society. So this is 40 years after the first one. In 1931, Pius XI wrote an encyclical 40 years later, it was called, and introduced the principle of subsidiarity for the common good. He said higher authorities were not to take over the authority of other groups. All must share in decision-making in a society for the common good. Now, subsidiarity was not like an absolute principle. It had to work with the other principles of social justice. It must be weighed alongside respect for each person, solidarity with those affected unjustly, and that it contributed to the common good. But as we know, that within a few years, that all turned to custard with the Second World War. And so it wasn't until after the Second World War in the 1960s that we get some more movement on social justice. Do you remember the 1960s? Some won't. Okay. In the post-war years, the popes again spoke about structural changes needed in society. In 1961, do you recognise him? John the 23rd wrote Mater et Magistra, saying that the church as a mother and a teacher encouraged the rebuild of communities in society, that promoted the socialisation, promoted a socialisation where people could participate in society and resist the kind of greed and violence that unleashed the Second World War. And he also, looking around, said, don't leave, in the rebuilding, don't leave rural people in rural areas behind. If they don't have the roads and infrastructure that help them participate in community, that won't work for them. Participation is needed for the common good. Then, just 2 years later, in 1963, John Paul XXIII again, he addressed the Cold War that was hotting up between Soviet Union and the US that threatened to annihilate the world. You remember that? He wrote Pacem et Terris, Peace on Earth. This was a significant social teaching, because it was the first time the Pope had written to the whole world, not just to the Church. A just society, he said, promotes peace and seeks to solve the world's economic, social, political and cultural problems peacefully for the universal common good, for the whole good of the world. Then in 1965, Vatican II put out the document Pastoral Constitution of the Church in the Modern World, Gaudium et Spes, in which they articulated again the ingredients for a just society. And he started to name them like marriage and family must be valued as the foundations of society. There has to be a proper development of culture, and that would be economic and social life. And that that governments needed to take their political responsibilities seriously. And there has to be a promotion of peace among nations, all respecting the dignity of the human person. Then, inspired by the Council, in 1967, Pope Paul VI wrote The Progress of People, and he said, again, the economy has to serve the people, but it also needs to develop culture and respect the dignity of all. He said, in a just society, people need not only money, but peace, justice, education, health, work, solidarity, and freedom of faith. And we come now to the 1970s. Take your minds back to 1970s, remember them? In 1971, Paul VI, oh no, that's, okay, 80 years after the first social encyclical, Paul VI updated the vision of the common good and what it would look like in the post-industrial society in an encyclical he called 80 Years Later. He said every society needs to attend to just solutions to the problems in urbanisation, condition of young people, condition of women, unemployment, population growth, social communication, and this is 1971, ecological damage. How long it's taken us to get to there. And he said, governments must make options for the poor, to introduce policies where the people share in resources. Now, you'll remember at this time we used to refer to the world as like the rich first world and the poor third world. Paul VI said social justice means that no country is to be left behind. And we moved then to the next one in the 1980s, in his long pontificate, John Paul II wrote 4 social encyclicals. In 1981, he wrote about work and the protection of workers, because he said, work brings fulfillment to the human person. It's not just to be drudgery. In 1987, he called attention to the failed development of the people in the third world, and he urged all people to focus on the being of humanity everywhere around the world so that all can thrive. And you'll remember at that time, third world debt to rich nations meant that they couldn't develop the education, the health, etc., needed for the good of society. And so again, he says, rich countries must make an option for the poor. And then on the centenary, this is 100 years later, of that first encyclical, Rerum Novarum, John Paul wrote about solidarity again, needed in the world. Now you'll remember just before this time that in Poland, we and the world saw how the Polish workers took on the authoritarian communist government to claim their rights. And they called their movement Solidarity. It was really backed with Catholic people taking on this social justice encyclical seriously. In 1994, John Paul II again wrote, this was his last encyclical of his time, his last social encyclical, Evangelium Vitae, Gospel of Life, in which he called all people to respect the sanctity of human life in their societies. He said, we must resist cultures of death that would bring about things like abortion and euthanasia. And we move now to this century. Benedict XVI in 2009 wrote Caritas in Veritate, Love and Truth. And he went back and articulated all the principles that the other popes had talked about since that very first social encyclical, over 200 years of social justice teaching. And he said, when you look at them all, what underlies them is that love means that we have to engage in justice and peace. It's not optional for us. And he said, it's love, not any other motivation, that will help the world solve the crushing problems of global poverty, the arms race, damage to the environment, mass migration of people, and sexual exploitation. You can see as it goes on, the more things that are issues in the world coming up. Yeah, so love is what's going to be under us all. And now, in our own time, we come to the crisis we're living in, one that affects the life of all in Earth. In 2015, Francis wrote Laudate Si, calling all people to care for our common home, Earth. All societies, he said, have to rein in our wastefulness of resources, our greed, our entitlement, our sense of superiority over other life, and humbly acknowledge that Earth is God's gift to us all, and that we share Earth as a home with all other life. Francis called on global governments and all societies to action to protect God's gift. And he said, Societies are to learn from the indigenous peoples of the world how to be in relationship with Earth again, to live within Earth systems. We don't control them, we just have to respect them. And then again in 2020, Francis wrote Fratelli Tutti, emphasising that in our common home, we are all brothers and sisters, and we must live as one global family, and he gave us this new one, in social friendship. Francis used the parable of the Good Samaritan as a guide for global acting. So that together we can solve the crises of the world. Faithful kindness, he said, is the ingredient of social friendship. Like the popes before him, Francis set out the principles of justice for societies of our time. He said, respect for human dignity, respect for human life, solidarity, and putting them together, solidarity, and option for the poor. And he pointed out the mass migration of people seeking refuge in other parts of the world because of political, economic, and climate-related problems. Earth is a common home, so we have to have better ways of accepting people to resettle in countries. And he talked about promoting peace, resisting death dealing. And he gave us a new teaching to abolish capital punishment. He said, that's not right any longer in the world. And to do everything to promote peaceful solutions to problems between nations. And of course, we're working on Ukraine and Russia at the moment. And then grouping together, economy must serve the people, respect human life, solidarity, subsidiarity, option for the poor. He said, abolishing trafficking and the enslaving of humans that's going on in our world. Workers must have wages with safe conditions and be able to unionise and advocate for justice. People can own private property, the private property though that we need. It's not a commodity to accumulate. The obscene wealth of a few is always at the expense of the global poor. And what's more, the rich lose their identification as members of the human family, start living as if they're not of this world. And then he grouped subsidiarity, that we must, and participation and social friendship. People must have a say in decisions that affect them. Information must be true and freely available. Rich governments do not make decisions for other countries or societies. They need to give support with partnerships based on social friendship. And then care for Earth, which was his latest, just before social friendship. Care for Earth, which involves solidarity, participation, subsidiarity, option for the poor, promotion of peace, sanctity of life. We must participate in society, he said, in such a way that Earth is protected. And all of these principles are for the common good. Decisions and actions that we take are to be weighed against the common good. Now, it doesn't mean that that's the most popular decision, that the most popular is the best. But he said the decisions that benefit the whole group are the ones to make where no one is left out, the poor particularly not left out. We wouldn't have poor if we had it like that. And love and social friendship will help us decide on the most just outcomes for our society. All this is Catholic social teaching, and is to make God's mission for the world a reality.